cloud. It says yes. Okay, that's recording, and then I will share this PowerPoint screen. Welcome everyone to this session. So it grew out of the dynamical systems discussion that we started back in January, which was really, I think, a good thing. We did a lot. We covered a lot of the basic sort of dynamical systems way of thinking. Attractors, bifurcations, things like that. And that itself grew out of a journal club that we had going. It started in person in 2019 and overlapped with the Corona era. We just focused on emergence, which is one of my favorite topics, which I also have a physics background, so that we kind of entered emergence. I entered emergence through the physics perspective. And before that, in 2017, that was how this mailing group actually started. I looked at Margaret Boden's history of cognitive science, Mind as Machine. So we spent a summer looking at that. So it kind of been growing since then. Me and Karthik especially, we talk a lot about, and Saurabh too actually, about how useful certain of Steve's ideas are, and we're the first to say, well, not everything will necessarily be workable, not all of it will be good for AI necessarily, but there's stuff that, especially for neuroscience, think people should use these tools, but we don't necessarily blame people for not getting it, because as several of you have said, it's like, seems kind of on the one hand complicated, and papers are not very easy to read. They're not always grounded in things that are solid and tangible, like neurotransmitters and receptors and things like that. They're pitched at a sort of intermediate level. So I've been meaning to do this, and when I heard, in fact, through a podcast, that Steve's book was coming out. He's been talking about this book for years, and like, oh, finally it's actually happening. So I thought, now's the time to do this retrospective. And those of you who have been in these groups or watched this before, you'll know that I'm not going to cleave very closely to any of this stuff. I'll pull material from wherever I can find to make it more coherent. First of all, to myself, and hopefully that everyone else will benefit from that too. I always like to sort of find historical threads linking things. I haven't done that enough with Steve, but there's some clues that we can follow. So, Grossbergian Neuroscience, what is it? So this is Steve. This is his house, right? I haven't been in this room, but yeah.
His living room, yeah.
Yeah, he has this interesting collection of masks. And people who've been in the field for a while have heard of him, maybe, but not necessarily know why he's famous, or but he's sort of notorious, famous/notorious for saying things like he basically solved everything in 1975. The impression you can get is that's his the main reason that he's famous is for saying that. But I would say that there's a certain amount of truth to that, and the question is how to sort of extract out which bits of that are true. But in this book by Margaret Boden called Mind as Machine, which is from 2006, she gave a fair amount of real estate in the book to talking about Steve, and conveyed, I think, a good kind of perspective on him, because he's sort of off on his own compared to a lot of things that are happening in the history. So she brings him up here in the context of the issue of credit. So she makes up these two names, Blogs and Scoggins, and she talks about how researchers squabble about who discovered what when. And so she attributes a few things to Grossberg, maybe the Marr-Albus model, Hopfield model. I think I've spoken to several people and they all agree that what Steve was doing was basically already the Hopfield model. And the self-organizing.
Even more general than the Hopfield model.
More general, exactly, yeah. Oh, by the way, yeah, anyone wants to jump in, say whatever you like, and ask questions, feel free. So yeah, it's when you're in a department that's not quite mainstream, it's good to occasionally hear from people who are outside of your circle that yes, this stuff is people are able to parse it. It's not something that's like a cult where you have to be initiated and only then do you get it. Other people can get it too. She also says that he pioneered backpropagation. I'm not very convinced of that, but I think Saurabh and
He actually helped all
Yeah.
verbose.
oh,
Yeah.
Was verbose's
really?
original idea, but then verbose was struggling with the math, so basically Steve sorted it out for him. So in that sense, he might be.
Yeah,
Oh.
I forget if it was Verbose while, at MIT working on his thesis, Steve was basically mentoring. And so,
Huh. Okay.
yeah,
Well,
pioneered would not be the right word, but he definitely
helped. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, he doesn't like backdrop. But anyway, good to know. So a bunch of us here who did our PhDs at this department, which no longer exists. Long story, kind of a soap opera plus bureaucracy and college campus politics, I suppose. But this is the website that I saw when I was deciding to become a neuroscientist, and covers kind of what. So Steve built this very idiosyncratic department at BU. After his PhD, he was at MIT for a while, and then got this deal he didn't get tenure at MIT, and then moved to BU, and he got a deal where he could set up his own department, a full-fledged department. He didn't have to teach undergrads, so it became kind of a haven for computational neuroscientists. So he recruited a very interesting collection of faculty, and the students also. He had a great knack for picking people, especially from other countries. So a lot of us here in this group, even, and several people who joined this department were from faraway places. We didn't come for interviews necessarily, but he really had an interesting sense of who to pick from, like India, Persia, China, all over the place. So
I'd just like to point out, in the interest of correct history, that Steve started CNS during his second stint at BU.
Second stint. Oh, okay.
So David Marr managed to get his tenure case kiboshed the first time around, and him and Gail went to Northeastern.
Okay, I didn't know who to ask about this history, but I'm glad you
And
fill it in.
then Silber realized he'd gotten snookered and hired them back.
Okay. Okay, good to know. So yeah, there's a whole story to tell. But yeah, I thought that to step back a bit and instead of diving into his ideas immediately, is to talk us about the field of neuroscience from the perspective of Eric L. Schwartz, dearly departed, beloved faculty member of CNS, and also the person who coined the term computational neuroscience, believe it or not. He edited this book in the late 80s, I believe, and apparently they were juggling different possible.
85, 86. Yeah.
They were juggling a few different terms for it, and he chose computational neuroscience. He's a very, very different sort of researcher from Steve. Didn't agree with Steve about much in terms of methodology or even subject matter to study. He is the one who came up with the log polar map of V1, the first sort of simple contained map of how V1 corresponds to retinotopic coordinates. And that's not a neural network. So it's a very different way of thinking that sort of under the radar all the time in neuroscience was really crucial as to kind of that there are certain properties of a sort of topological nature that you really have to keep in mind. But anyway, at the start of his Intro to Computational Neuroscience course, he drew this pentagram on the board and said, before all of you first year students, you need to know a little bit about the sociology of the field. And he drew this out. He said that there's this spectrum, it's a circle, and you could start at the top and say that there are these sort of blue sky thinkers. They have very spherical cow style thinking, where the physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists have a very idealized notion of what it is that the brain does and what constitutes mimicking the brain, or even sort of very broadly emulating what the brain does. Then you have more kind of closer to the actual brain, experimental physicists, engineers, computer programmers doing what we would typically call computational neuroscience, where coding is involved. And then you kind of swing down, if you're going counterclockwise, you get the kind of computation used in analysis of experiments by the biologists. For some reason, he didn't include the doctors in there, but if we were to expand this into a hexagon, the doctors would be between the biologists and the psychologists. Then you kind of go up around the other end and you come to the philosophers, who in their own way are kind of similar to the pure mathematicians and the theoretical physicists in their degree of abstraction. So you could talk about what tools these different groups use. So way at the top, you have fairly abstract methodologies that don't necessarily map directly onto recordings that experimentalists make. Information theory, graph theory, AI ideas, starting with axioms and being very sort of symbolic. And then you have what most of us who call ourselves computational neuroscientists are off on this left corner, studying mappings of various sorts, running simulations, making neural nets artificial or more biological. And then as you kind of move down towards the experiments, we're doing kind of statistical analyses, which is why that overlaps with the experimental crowd. So now that the world of computational analysis is everywhere in experimental biology. You can't really do anything in experimental biology without reasonably sophisticated math. It's hard to publish a qualitative paper, but as late as the 80s, you could publish papers where people said, well, I stuck an electrode in there and I heard the neurons firing. And that won a Nobel Prize. So there you have the classic methods of experimental biology. And then you get to psychology, which I think doesn't get as much respect as it maybe deserves in the neuroscience community. Like a lot of people will be like, oh, psychologists don't know what they're talking about, or it's all just hand waving, or there's a lot of dumping.
I just want to point out that I just want to point out that Eric himself had a sign on his door that said "No Psychology Zone." So
yeah. So, but I have a soft spot for psychology. I just finished a book on the history of psychology, and I really think that there is a space for these slightly under-constrained ideas, and we all end up using them. And in a sense, the reason that we're in this field, most of us, not all of us, but a fair number of us are in here because of psychological phenomena. Motor control is great and all that, but it's psychological phenomena that we're interested in, I think. And then you have abstract concepts, which are, even further removed from the experimental data than all these others. So Eric called the sort of right half of this diagram the verbal fringe, and he didn't particularly like it, but I like the fact that he gave a place for everybody in this scheme.
On the topic of psychology, I've been finding, or sort of seeing from the perspective recently, that a lot of neuroscience really uses as a groundwork the assumption that the basic ideas in psychology are all the right language to talk about, what we're trying to find neural things for, and that when you start to call that into question and say, maybe attention isn't one thing, maybe it overlaps with other things, maybe we don't have the right concepts in psychology, suddenly it becomes a lot more interesting, and you kind of have to look back at it.
Yeah. It's definitely the kind of thing to, that's the thesis that provokes all these various antitheses. And it has to play that role in some sense, because it's sort of like this bin that collects all these intuitions that have been kicking around since prehistoric times in some sense. And in that sense, it overlaps strongly with the philosophy, because that also is a very large bin of ideas.
I would also just like to point out along those lines that Steve uses a lot of terms that are in the psychology literature in very, very precisely and specifically defined ways. And if you're not cognizant of that, you will completely lose the line on the message.
This is a big problem, actually, because sometimes he uses these terms in an idiosyncratic way that's not quite how everybody else uses them. So, let the buyer beware. So I decided to just sort of place suggestive Greek letters at the corners. And I think a good chunk of you will get why I put these letters on here. And I'm going to let you guys, if anyone does not get it, I will explain it, but I'd like you guys to just look at it for a moment, and I feel like all of you will get it.
I disagree, man. I don't want to be called gamma. I want to be called alpha. This is like
Oh, gamma, man. That's a lambda.
I don't want to be a lambda either. I want to be an alpha. What are you talking about?
You don't like lambda calculus?
Wait, is that the empty set?
The Aleph is like, just because it has such a great
No,
history.
on the right.
On the right. The empty.
It's
No,
a phi.
man,
It's a
so
phi.
high.
Epsilon.
Phi for philosoph, right?
Yeah, psi has been used for psychology for a long time, so it's not. And chi, there's a reason for that one too. The chi-square distribution, and that sort of thing. So it's Greek puns all around. But
Yeah, psychology, I guess.
psychology. Yeah, that's on t-shirts probably. So anyway, Grossberg hangs out over there. Grossberg, I don't think, has ever run a simulation of his own, as far as I know.
One.
Wow.
And it was a total disaster, and Gail had to clean it up.
Grossberg is over there, and his students and postdocs are further down on that. I mean, not that his students and postdocs don't think at the most abstract, but the students and postdocs and collaborators.
They have to do actual work.
Yeah.
The other thing, and again, this is more a sort of general point about CNS, but it brought in people with backgrounds from everything from theology to like biology to psychology. So it certainly, the program was built in order to bring in people from all of those corners, right?
There were doctors there too. Arash is a doctor, a medical doctor. So yeah, that made it a great
Arash, not
community.
just Arash.
Arash is a plural.
Arash is a medical doctor. I didn't know that. I invited Arash. He might show up for one of the future ones, and I told him if he wants to present his work, he can do that.
Do you want me to send something to Arash Fazal?
Anyone who wants to talk about like stuff that grew out of this and which they think would be of interest to us, quite open. So just for mischief purposes, I thought it would be nice to contrast Steve's way of thinking with David Marr. And as Nico kind of gave you a clue, there's a bit of a history here, which I don't particularly want to talk about now, but everyone you talk to in neuroscience who's caught even a whiff of computational neuroscience knows about David Marr's 3 levels. And if this was an infinite series approximation, I would be very happy to include this as my first 2 terms in that series. But then I would be like, we can't stop there. So what I mean by that is that, so this is the idea that there are, when you split up a problem, when you're studying the brain or trying to do computer vision, not the same thing, but in David Marr's head, they're sort of similar. You're trying to say, well, what is the system doing in a broad sense? And that's the computation. How does it do it in a fairly abstract sense, symbolic sense? And then what are the physical ways to implement the algorithm? So this example from a very good paper by Krakauer, Gazanfar, and colleagues. I highly recommend this paper, even though I have complaints about it. This was about saying that we need to analyze behavior more. And from their perspective, it's because we need to understand what the computations are that animals are attempting to perform before we can make claims about the implementation. And that's true as far as it goes. So this example with the bird is that the computation is flight in the abstract. Flapping is the algorithm, and the feathers, muscles, etc., are the implementation. So this ties into a kind of a way of working where you start by identifying the computation, work down into a detail, and then you say, okay, how much of the physical detail do I need? And I go back up again. The epistemological bias, I guess, is sort of clear. But my complaint about this is that if you're working as a neuroscientist, you should not follow these instructions as a research strategy, because you should not be too confident that you know what the computation is to begin with. So I like to gloss these terms as the goal/function, the method, loosely defined, whatever that is, and the structure. So you may think you know what the animal is trying to do, but you may be wrong. And that is really, really important to keep in mind. So when you're looking at some phenomenon that's got a combination of recording of behavior and some structural stuff and some physiological data, electrophysiological data, it may not always be clear what exactly you're looking at for or at even, but very often there's you kind of look based on some normative criteria, Darwinian considerations about survival, and then some other additional normative criteria. And you say, okay, this is what I think this system is doing, but it's subject to revision, not just because you changed what your computational high-level idea is, but in my case, I've had this experience where I'm looking at some detailed phenomenon in the thalamus, and that changes what I think the method is, or the algorithm is, and that in turn makes me sort of a bit more open-minded about what the computation might be, or what the function might be. So jumping across levels and blurring them is in general more recommended for, I would say, for a grad student. And there's a sense in which that hierarchy seems like it's fixed. Like once you pick an organism, it's like there's a set of functions or computations and then whatever. But I think that's like a moving window. So it's like depending on what phenomenon you're looking at, what counts as the computation and what counts as the structure will vary. So you could start in biology, the first kind of port of call where you're actually doing biology and not chemistry or physics is something like phenomena at the level of the membrane, like biomolecules, proteins, things like that, right? And it's very difficult to even describe these things without a functional perspective. I would challenge anyone to talk about it in purely, physical terms. It's very difficult. And then you kind of move up to slightly higher levels, things like patch clamp, where you're looking at electrical properties of individual bits of membrane, or you can suck up an individual receptor even. So these are things that might be considered implementation of physical details from one perspective, but if you drop down, they're also performing some sort of computation. And it really depends on what phenomenon you're interested in. So there's a kind of embedding of one, like structure at one level looks like is function at a lower level. So yeah, you can keep going up this hierarchy, and at each stage, when you look down, you're kind of assuming something, and you look up, and that thing is sort of taking for granted what's at the lower level. At each stage, if you look at, you can probably recognize what all these things are, right? So at each stage, you're describing things using some structural basis, some physiological description of the time varying parts, and you're talking about what that is doing. It may not be a function from the perspective of the whole organism. It's some sort of function. Like look at like even these terms, which this is some work from our lab, which is about connections from area 25 to other parts of the cortex. And these terms, feedback and feed forward, they're used sort of as anatomical terms, but they are very suggestive as functional terms. And this is the way it kind of is always in neuroscience. And you can go at the very high scales, then even people are sort of stable structures for functions of source societies and ecologies. So I feel like it's this three-level perspective, even if you want to use it. It's sort of like you can shift it around, and what the computation is will be different depending on where you're looking. So even if you do want to use that, which I think is okay, like I said, as a first pass. And so Grossberg, not super interested in very low-level stuff, although I'm sure he's aware of a lot of it. So he sits right in this middle, and for reasons that I think a lot of us who are interested in behavior can relate to, which is that if I spend my time looking at, spine turnover rates and things like that, I can't typically correlate that with behavior, or the very little behavior I can correlate it with. So you go from the spike level to a little bit higher to the coarse-grained rate-based models, and then you look at mesoscale connectivity, and then because of the way the methods work, these are easier to correlate with behavior. So that's where Grossberg kind of fits in, and a lot of his. But some of his students have definitely done much more biophysically detailed models than anything he initially came up with, including Jesse, who's here. The other way to situate Grossberg is in the history of neuroscience, psychology, cog-sci, and the AI world. This is an incomplete timeline I made in 2017. I added a few bits here and there, but if anyone wants to help me with this, let me know, and I'll make this sort of accessible. I couldn't find an efficient way to make this, like with a kind of modular, clickable software way. But if anyone has suggestions, let me know. But yeah, so Grossberg finished his PhD in '64. You can see my mouse, right? And that was at the kind of end of a really, really crucial era, the post-World War kind of explosion of a whole lot of new sciences. Like a lot happened in this, where the green bar is, right? The formation of this new thing called cognitive science. Psychology kind of got over its behaviorist hang up, and computer science kind of came out of nowhere and revolutionized everything. So Steve started publishing papers in '68, and he keeps saying that he developed art in '76, but this particular paper doesn't call the model art, so it's proto-art.
1972B was the first paper that discussed what would turn into art.
Oh, okay. So, but did he use the term resonance? Because in this paper, he didn't call it resonance.
I would have to go back and look.
Yeah, anyway, but yeah, that's a minor thing. But yeah, so he was doing this stuff. If you look across the columns, right, at what's happening everywhere else, this is just around the time that the cognitive revolution is happening, and everyone's thinking in terms of symbols and like what we call GoFi now, good old-fashioned AI. So Miller, for instance, has this kind of what was it, like act, check. There's a loop which looks a lot like an if-then loop, basically. But people got a lot out of it, and so that was the way people thought for a while. But Steve was kind of doing this other thing involving differential equations that the cyberneticists would have been able to appreciate, but they were kind of had a lull at this point. I'm not sure what they were up to. Then there was this second cybernetics, which Maturana and Varela were involved in, but I don't know whether or how they linked with what Steve was up to.
We can have an offline discussion about this, Johan, but this
Excellent.
is missing a huge amount of stuff that I just know off the top of my head.
Excellent. Yes, we'll talk about this.
Yeah, that would be cool to be a part of too. I'm fascinated with what happened to cybernetics in that sense. So just
cool. Yeah, I haven't followed that. In the '70s, I don't know. It's hard to follow what was happening.
I just wanted to say the cognitive revolution was very slow in emerging.
Okay. The way it's presented, it's like Chomsky reviews B.F. Skinner's book,
right? Yeah, and it emerges in the late 50s, early 60s. But the first textbook or the first book got laying around here that really names cognitive psychology isn't until the mid-late 60s.
Right. Yeah. I remember there's some nice illustrations in that book.
Yeah, and it's a great book. I think it's still relevant today. I read it before preparing for my cognitive psych class I'm teaching this summer, and I've pulled from it a little bit.
Nice.
But I was grad school, 80s. Took me forever because I was working full time while I was doing my dissertation. But just about the whole faculty, even the biopsychologists, which is the department I'm in, had all been trained as behaviorists. And they still, the cognitive psychologists in the department had a little corner in the building, and they were weirdos. And everyone looked at them as weird, and they were weird.
Interesting.
And I took a animal cognition class that one was endocrinologist, the other was comparative psychologist taught. And that was radical. And just the way they talked about animal cognition was with a lot of hesitation and everything else. So it wasn't this big fast revolution. It was much emerging, and behaviorism had a much longer lasting effect than.
Oh yeah, I encountered some radical behaviorists on Twitter recently, and I was like, wow, you guys still exist. Their journals are still there,
Well, it's a lot simpler way of looking at things. It keeps it neat. Yeah. So,
and neuroscience would not exist without those methods that they used, really.
Exactly.
But yeah, there's a whole lot to talk about in this. It's just in that green band. Yeah. But anyway, let's move. I zoomed in a little bit just to look at what else was happening. I just put a few kind of highlights there. I should have pointed out back here, one of the threads which we have to pick up on historically is that unconscious inference from Helmholtz is a big influence on Steve and on many people, and the Gestalt psychologists, and on Friston. The Gestalt psychologists came out, they were a little later. Did I put that in here? Yeah. Right at the time when behaviorism was about to take over America, the Gestalt psychologists started to kind of talk about some very interesting things. So Steve picks up on these threads and adds some things that they didn't really anticipate, and which very few people actually have, which I'll get to. So yeah, if we zoom in a little bit, the stuff that Steve was talking about in this dissertation was, just at the time when glutamate and GABA were being, and some of those neurotransmitters were even being discovered. It was pretty early days for neural modeling.
I'm shocked that you made it through this without J.J. Gibson and the Purple Perils showing up in your summary.
I'm sorry, I forgot. I told you it's incomplete. But yeah, I need to, because I've been encountering Gibsonians lately who are virulently anti-representation, which I find difficult to even parse, let alone discuss. But anyway, that's another
we have
discussion.
some people here. Don't
Yeah, we will talk him down.
One other thing. So the 68 papers, there's a collection that came out in 68. Steve had a big chunk of work published. Actually, to be fair, I don't know if it was published or if it was a manuscript that he'd sent around, but his 64 like magnus opus was just...
I have a treat for you guys. It's
okay.
coming.
All right, I will keep quiet then.
But yeah, so Margaret Bowden has a very useful term for a certain phenomenon that exists in psychology. It's this counterculture, which on Twitter I keep encountering this counterculture, which kind of guns blazing against symbols and representations, and part of me kind of empathizes, because it sounds a bit like me being against reductionism. So I'm like, okay, I see why people don't like certain ideas. They come associated with a certain kind of individualism and whatever. But so this book, which turned out to be fairly influential, kind of coined a new term, inactivism, which I don't fully understand what it is, but I think it's the idea that the mind is not locked up in the head, but it's an event, a process that takes place in the interactions with the world. And so this book, first published in 91 by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche, was apparently fairly influential. I started reading it. I found it a very strange book, but they categorize a bunch of the thinkers at the time on this spectrum of whether they are cognitivists, which is the mainstream that they are against, and whether they are emergentists, and then whether they are inactivists. So they categorize Steve as way off in the territory of inactivism, which means, so in this, I think everyone who's far away from the middle is good. And the villains of the piece are hanging out in the middle over here. I can appreciate why he's an emergentist. I don't get why Steve is an activist, but maybe if I read the book, I'll get.
How does Patricia Churchland not make this chart?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very strange chart, but I was thinking, well, what if we wrap this around and make a sphere out of it? What's the polar opposite of cognitivism? The North Pole to its South Pole. Just something to think about.
You can wrap it in such a way that all of them can be at poles.
Well, yeah, well, that's the whole point of it, right? That once you do that, every person is isomorphic to a pole. Anyway, so what Saurabh was just mentioning was this 64 PhD thesis. I don't know why it's only part one, but part one is 500 pages long. And I highlighted a few things. This is the table of sections. This is 5 pages of it. So I'm just going to let you guys sort of look at it a bit, but I'll read out a few things that stood out to me. Resolution of contiguity and gestalt theories. local strength fields do not suffice. This is a theme which he has been hammering on, which I think is an excellent theme. And it's very non-reductionist in an emergent in the context of neural networks. Intrinsic renormalizability. I was kind of excited that he even used that term when that was just sort of coming into being in physics also. Lateral inhibition and renormalizing fields in the thalamus. That's very specific. There you go, 38, Nico. Markov models do not suffice.
One of the few pieces of Steve's writing that I've not read. So
yeah, we have to look at this.
Yeah, if anyone does a reading group on this, definitely let me know.
I mean, I'll try and do a quick thing so I can bring the bits into the other discussion as far as I can.
I wish I'd read all of this, but even like number 28, right? ABC leads to D does not equal C leads to D, right? So getting that the Markov property doesn't, hold in the brain and in the world and so on. Like, there's a lot of really
yeah, I'm like, you could look at this and think this must be a crazy person, but when you read it, it's like, no, there's a lot here. It's not that it's all right. It's just that it's all a fairly sober take. There's nothing wacky about it. It's just, it's a little idiosyncratic.
Do you think his committee actually read this?
Hard to say. His advisor was Giancarlo Rota, whose work was not very related to this sort of thing.
Was this PhD or was this while he was at Rockefeller?
Related than you think if you look at it carefully.
I think I was reading an interview that Steve was being interviewed, and he was talking about this. I think it was when he was at Rockefeller, and it was this 500-page thing, and I think like nobody could read it, so they sent it around to some other people at other institutions to judge it. I could look up some details right now and get back to you.
There's definitely one of those books, History of Talking Nets, or like Talking Nets, whatever, History of Neural Networks. I forget the names now, but I believe Steve had sent this around to various labs around the country that were psychology, neuroscience, whatever. And there are comments from other researchers, like, I think Umahart and McClellan, like, just folks being like, and this guy sent us this 500-page manuscript, and we didn't get a single word of it. Like, we didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
Yeah,
but
it's
a lot of really, I mean, Karthik and I were going back and forth on this. There's like a prelude to Kolmogorov complexity in here. At around the same time Kolmogorov was coming up with that, there's just a lot of really, really good ideas. And that's just from browsing. I haven't read this ever.
Yeah, I started, in fact, with Stefan, who might join in a future thing. We were thinking of trying to go through it. We started, but we didn't get very far. Non-localizability and stability of representations. Again,
I found,
see where,
Sorry, I found the quote from his interview, if you guys want to hear it.
Yeah, go for it.
So he's saying, each graduate student at Rockefeller wrote up a first-year project. My first-year project in 1964 to 65 turned out to be a monograph of around 500 pages, which synthesized my main results of the past 10 years. It was called The Theory of Embedding Fields with Applications to Psychology and Neurophysiology. It took me a long time to write it, and then the question was what to do with it. Several professors realized that students don't write 500-page monographs every day. They wanted to get someone to evaluate it. So they arranged with me to mail it with a cover letter to 125 of the main psychology and neuroscience labs throughout the world. It went to David Hubel. It went to Steve Kuffler. It went to Eric Kendall. It went actually to most of the major neuroscientists and cognitive scientists in the world at that time. Unfortunately, no one seemed ready to understand it. But then he says that monograph shaped his work for the next 10 or so years, at least.
40 years. So if you look at 85, rigidity, plasticity, continuum, again, very good point, not that complicated. It's just was maybe too early for some people. But also they probably just didn't read any of it. Neuroglial duality. I was very surprised to see the word glia there, because I thought the glia hype only happened in the 90s, but apparently he was looking at glia even then. And yeah, so there's all the stuff here. I can send this out if people want to look at it. But yeah, even what is an object? Section 165. Which is a very good question.
Johann happened in the late 60s.
What happened in the late 60s?
The first real interest in glia.
In the 60s. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So he was keyed in. I was reminded of this line from the Mahabharata, describing the Mahabharata. What is here is found elsewhere. What is not here is nowhere. It's not true of the Mahabharata or this, but you can't help but think that. Okay, so there's many ways to start with the Grossberg kind of world. He seems to have tried for an all of the above approach with this chapter 1. So I was reading this and I was like, what's the way in here? Because he has this habit. He's been doing this since his talks of like giving these like little snippet ideas of I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, and you kind of can't catch your breath really. Hopefully we'll be able to go slowly and pay attention to whatever we want to. And so the idea that I think has the most wide appeal and which might be the most radical is this kind of blending of the Helmholtzian idea of active inference with some of these counterexamples from Kanitsa and fitting that with this differential equation framework. So Helmholtz had this idea that we see what we expect based on prior learning. So it was all about prior expectation. And Kanitsa was like, well, I can give you things that you see that aren't based on your prior experience. So maybe there's more to it than that. He didn't have an explanation, or at least Steve claims that Kanitsa didn't have an explanation. But here's a nice example. When you look at the plus and the square on the left, do you get the impression that one of them is on top of the other? Well, I guess it depends on a lot of factors, but a lot of people see the plus as kind of on top. And with the one on the right, this one I actually do see that you tend to see the horizontal bars of the plus are underneath as it's specified, but the vertical ones are on top. And Kanitsa point out that it's not really prior experience that would make you see that. There's something else to it because it doesn't seem particularly likely. So this
Johan, is it important to differentiate prior experience ontologically versus developmentally? Like you may not have ever seen a cross embedded within a wiry hoop or something like that, but the physics of the natural world have been the physics of the natural world ever since biological life kind of first started trying to interact with the world. And so it's like your perceptual system has fit to that set of rules. And so in a way you have seen it before, right? It's just not you. A biological organism has.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I just think that it's hard to cash that out.
How would you differentiate the two, Mac?
No, I think it's all kind of word games. I'm just trying to get my head around where the pushback is, right? Because I feel like back in the day, people weren't thinking like Tinbergen, right? They were saying, you've never seen this thing before, therefore there's no such thing as a top-down expectation. But top-down expectations are nebulous.
Yeah, that's true. Once you bake in like the developmental pathways that create the hyperpriors is a term I heard recently, then you're like, yeah, okay, the species has expectations, which is fine.
We should be very careful here because going down that path is basically suggesting a sort of preformism here, which is kind of, I think it does violate expectation, right? Like if we were to say that everything in the world was somehow to be kind of coded, then it's sort of like a preformism here, right? Like if I were to say that is it ontological versus developmental or something like that.
It doesn't have to be preformed. It can be looser. So you could say that the statistics of the selective history created certain structural biases, and these quirks are the consequences of those structural biases, which Steve wouldn't disagree with either. But I think that when people initially started talking about prior experience and with the long history of associationism, they were mainly thinking of of what people have actually seen in their lifetimes.
Yeah, they're thinking developmentally.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, you could explain this with the more if you see two things overlapping, the more complex objects should be thought of as more close than the simpler object, or something simple. I don't know this literature that well, but you could come up with like rules that could have been fit to by natural selection without having to like pretend like there's a clean slate. Because like all this was on the background of clean slate stuff, right? Which is a bit kind of hard to even know what it means. So anyway, I don't mean to disrupt. I just want to.
No, please do. I haven't put a lot together anyway. So, but I think that this is the thing that I wanted to get at, because there's something not very intuitive about insights from illusions. So the very next thing I wanted to address and get that out of the way early is why should we care about this stuff? Because Gibson, for instance, was notoriously unwilling to talk about illusions. So you could say, well, these illusions are tricks and don't tell us anything about ecologically relevant perception. Sort of. That's an extreme take, but the response to something like this, that's an impoverished view, because what happens in unnatural situations can give us clues about constraints. So even if something is rare or bizarre, it's the fact that it happens at all is telling us something about the implementation, to use Marr's, or maybe even the algorithm. It gets vague, right, at this point. So just to like, so it's the mode of science is to take things out of their natural context, to sort of and see what happens, and then reintegrate them if you can. That latter step often very rarely happens actually, but taking things out of their natural context is normal in any science. It's very difficult to actually put things back in. I was talking to Mac about this actually the other day, about why Darwin may be the greatest dialectical thinker of all time, is because he abstracts things out of their context, quite literally looking at specimens, beaks, and different sorts of things, and studying them in the way that an analytical person would, but then reintegrating them into their environments, both and conceptually, and integrating variability into a picture of the environment. So it's not this holism, but it's you take what you've learned from the analytic approach and put it back in. This rarely happens actually, and it needs to happen more in neuroscience and biology generally.
Another thing you could say about illusions, Johan, is that they clearly do happen in a subset of the population, right? If you take the right pharmacological agent, have too many bath salts after dinner tonight, you can go around seeing things perceptually that aren't actually in the world. They're not veridical, and it's not light bouncing off of an object and hitting your retina and then translating up your visual hierarchy or something so you perceive it. It's something about your brain's activity that then imbues some structure on your experience. So this is like a part of the realm of our Umwelt as it is. So Gibson can say there's no such thing as those things, but it's not really true, right? This is part of the thing we're trying to describe. And it might be the tail, it could be a glitch in the system or something of it not functioning adaptively, but it's clearly something that happens in many different contexts, right? You can hallucinate after taking certain drugs, but you can also hallucinate if you have schizophrenia, which is a particular condition, or if you have Parkinson's disease, those people, they can hallucinate. In some sense, something like tinnitus or having a migraine, having an illusion of a fortification scotoma or an aura when you're having a migraine attack is like a hallucination. It's not a veridical perception. And so I think that's, I don't know, Gibson probably should have, expanded his mind just a little to try to kind of take the concept in. So.
I've been thinking about this a lot the last week, and part of it was what you're talking about last week, Mac, about how fast networks can change, that plasticity on the fly.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, Gibson was never a trail runner.
Never what?
I do a lot of running on trails, right? And when the weather gets warm, roots have a way of disguising themselves as snakes. When the weather gets cold, roots don't care about looking like snakes. And the difference is in the spring, I have the expectation of seeing snakes on the trail. In fact, I saw 3 the other day. Fortunately, none of them were poisonous, but 3. Yeah. But in the winter, the snakes are, they don't care about being out on the trail and bothering me. So I don't look for them. The other thing I tend to see a lot on trails are bears. Not real bears, but old rotten stumps. They will look more like a bear than an actual bear. It's a very real image. And a couple of weeks ago, my dog and I were running on a trail, and I had him on the leash because there are a lot of hikers, but he just stopped. He froze, and the hair in his back came up a little bit off to where he was looking, and I swore I saw a bear. And we just, both of us stood there for a while looking at this thing. And Arlo, my dog, doesn't like to stand too long. He likes running. All right? He wants to keep moving, but he's not saying anything. He's not moving. I'm not moving. And neither one of us wants to turn around. It's a beautiful day, just got started. And this thing looks like a bear, but it's not acting like a bear. It's not moving, you know? And I see the hair go down in Arlo's back, and I think he's like me. He's kind of figuring out that this may not be a bear. So we move up a couple feet on the trail. Still looks like a bear, but it's not moving. So move a little bit more, and I realize it's just a stump, and it's been rotting out. And it's that blackness and the shape of the stump that gives it that bear look.
Mm.
What's amazing there is, one was just how real it looked, right? But then as soon as I recognized it as a stump, how that image went away, my arousal went away, you know, my heart rate came down. I wasn't that scared, but I have been at times like this. But, you know, it was just this instant change. And I'd never thought about how instant that change was until your talk last week, Mac. And then reading, starting Grossberg and him talking about this sort of thing. But
awesome.
We've
got some work.
Yeah, you don't have to.
We've got some work coming out soon. Oh, sorry, go finish.
Cool. Yeah, you don't have to trip to. You know?
Well, maybe you were.
Actually, that's the point.
Like,
we don't even have to go into those conditions, because if you think about like how the early psychophysicists were actually trying to figure out, they were basically just making people look at the threshold of whether they can see something or not see something. So basically, the way in which the whole field has evolved is to, like, maybe we can't say the exact mechanisms, but we can actually put the constraints, or rather the bounds within which or whatever perceptual phenomenon kind of operates. That's the whole point of all the psychophysicists being so successful in the 19th century and giving us bounds, right? So I would say it's like we don't even have to go into that altered state or any of those things. So
yeah, exactly.
I think that's also, like, at a high level, if I had to describe Steve's work and what's so sort of really insightful about it, Steve always had this way of finding and actually also the one thing I would say that it is most distinguishing between Steve's work and Marr's work, for example, is the fact that Steve looked at things at both this high level perception, like who was talking about perception and how actually low level circuitry might give rise to high level percepts, right? And like Steve did this wonderful thing of always saying, like, let's find the edge cases or boundary cases, and let's see what we can infer about the way the circuitry behaves, but then also see if we can predict based on that low level circuit notion of what's going on, what other perceptual phenomena at a high level that hasn't been described yet might actually be describable, right? And so it distinguishes him from Marr because it says at a high level perceptually, we don't actually know exactly what's going on. So let's find those edge cases that break things. And then let's bounce between high and low levels to see if the notion that we have about neural circuitry or whatever actually can explain how that mechanism gives rise to that percept. You know, he sort of has this very clear way of asking that question and then poking, you know?
Yeah. And I admit that when I joined CNS, and CN 530 was the course on vision, and Ennio Mingola was teaching these things where there was a there were several visual illusions every week. And for a while, I was quite stumped by I was like, what does all this have to do with the brain? And because coming from a physics background, it just seemed really weird. But eventually, once I wrapped my head around it, it was like, wow, this is quite a powerful method, because you're not just trying to explain the perception of the illusion. So Steve's really good at reintegrating, as what Saurabh said, reintegrating those insights into the naturalistic case and showing how that helps solve certain, ecologically relevant problems.
So Johan, before you go to the next slide, this figure with the cat's naturally started gratings question used to grate Hubel so much. I don't know.
I missed it. What?
Hubel hated that question so much. Oh, do cats really stare at gratings or all that stuff? So Hubel just got so irritated one of the times when someone asked him, oh, but cats never see gratings and all that stuff. Hubel's reply was, I could always spit on the platform, but I could never gather myself to do it. So that was his reply to people who were saying you should actually use naturalistic stimuli and all that stuff. So
not exactly an answer, but yeah. So this is it's become my mantra, my version of. I think Steve should use it. We don't see boundaries; we see with boundaries. Not always, but there are certain types of boundaries that we don't actually see, but they're part of perception. Like the triangle, the invisible triangle that you see on the left, or perceive, or whatever you want to call it. There's something experiential about that triangle, and the neon color spreading on the right. So you see a bluish disc, but the only pixels colored are the ones on those thread-like line. So some boundaries, they're amodal, they don't have a modality. They're constructed using global properties of the visual scene. And Steve has what we looked at, I think, right from the chapter 2, we start diving into the visual models. This is what Steve wants to focus on, that global properties, which the gestalt psychologists pointed out, can be turned into systems of differential equations under certain assumptions to give you something in the neural network that's analogous to the subjective experience. So you can there's a lot of things you could talk about. Is that how coherent is that? But it's a very interesting approach. So why aren't these boundaries perceived? That there's something that triggers the awareness or the use of boundaries, which in this case on the right, it's used to allow the color to leak into that boundary. If any of you have been to a talk by Marge Livingston, she sometimes shows this most amazing demonstration where where one of the things that holds up the illusion is removed, and you actually subjectively see the color leaking out. It's quite extraordinary. Maybe you'll find it on YouTube somewhere. But so this clearly has a strong impact on perception, but we don't directly see them. Why not? Steve has a very interesting answer, which I didn't fully understand back in grad school. He was saying that amodal boundaries enable forms of object permanence, so you can know where an object is even when it passes behind something. So you're using your knowledge of the boundary to maintain a representation of the boundary, say as it passes behind a tree. But because there's a discrepancy between what you know and what you see, you don't get confused about where the object is and walk through a tree. This will either sound like an absurdity or something very interesting, but it's at the very least a very interesting way to think. And this is why Steve is willing to say that his theories are theories of consciousness. I have my doubts about that, about whether it will satisfy anyone, but I think it's a very interesting way to ask about a kind of informational separation, so that having a perspective means that there needs to be some kind of difference between what you know and what you see. And in this case, for maintaining object order in what's behind what, without having like if you're hunting for something, it doesn't disappear from your awareness when it goes behind a tree. You can actually anticipate where it will show up on the other side based on various considerations about how fast it's moving. So I want to think about this more, but it's a very interesting thought that maintenance of object outline identity is distinct from the kind of information you need to know what's obstructing what. And we'll definitely talk about it more. So speaking of Ennio used to ask this question at almost at the end of every lecture that he gave. And for a while I was like, what is this mysterious question? What are the units? And I don't have a complete answer, but it was a great question. In the long run, it was an excellent question. Because as a grad student, in your first year or two, you're vaguely fumbling towards a problem, and you're asking about various sorts of units. What level of neural abstraction should I use? What are the units of the measurement of the behavior? How should the behavior be characterized? All these things are units of a sort. They're things that you kind of take for granted as the elements that you start with. And Steve often starts with something at an intermediate level of abstraction. They're not quite measurable. So I mentioned this earlier, but it's good to stress this, that when he's talking about subjective experience, there's a spatio-temporal isomorphism between what you experience and some neural activity pattern. And it's easy to say it in a short way, but when you kind of cash it out into what it means, when there's multiple networks that are representing different pieces of a scene, somehow they're all together in your perception. It's not the case that you're creating a little world, like a little mini world inside of you, because in some sense that would be useless, because you haven't actually added any value addition. You're just like taking something and placing it inside your head is of no use. So this isomorphism between neural pattern and the subjective experience is part of this idea of like analyzing what's coming into separate pieces that are all potentially useful for some sort of behavior. And so for most neuroscientists, you might be like, what am I looking at here? Are we talking about spikes? Are we talking about firing rates, ensembles of neurons, and the percentage of the region that's been recruited? The answer is yes. So we got into the habit when we were writing the method section of our papers to say, consider X to be the firing rate of a neuron or a group of neurons. It was like the standard phrase that we would see in these papers. And it's not a bad way to start, because we're not making any particularly strong assumptions about these units. They move up when you excite them, and they move down when you inhibit them. We don't typically make use of any of the fancy currents that do exist. Like there's these really weird slow potassium currents and low threshold calcium and high threshold calcium, all kinds of wild stuff. We've never, at least I'm not aware of anyone who's used them to do something qualitatively really useful, but Jesse would be the one to ask.
Yeah, Jesse's the one who's done it.
Well, in some sense, I just did it to fit these, to kind of justify the firing rate levels, is to show that, right. If you include the details, that can actually correspond pretty well. Yeah. The principles still kind of apply, even if you bring in details.
So there's lots and lots of degrees of freedom, which is simultaneously good for the modeler, but also makes other people not so easy to convince, which maybe is a good thing. People shouldn't believe neural modelers too easily. So this is the bread and butter of a Grossberg style model, this equation, which we looked at briefly earlier, but for those who don't like looking at these types of things, this green term is an excitation. What this means basically is that the activity is capped. There's some maximum, after which further excitation doesn't do anything. And there are two terms that drag activity back down. There's the inhibition, which can come from various other cells, and a passive decay. And the excitation you can break up further into some external input from some other area or cells, or from the outside world if it's a sensory transducer, and positive feedback. I think this is really important. In fact, I asked Karthik, who else uses positive feedback regularly outside of audio engineers and things like that? And I haven't got a good answer, but I need to dig into this a little bit more. One term of art that Steve sometimes uses is recurrent competitive fields. So these units, which could be neurons or groups of neurons, are assumed to have two types of connections. They can excite themselves using some transfer function, which is typically some sort of monotonic function of the activity. And then these red are inhibitory connections. We typically use these flat lines to represent inhibition and normal arrows to represent excitation. But you can't follow the color code. A lot of people use red for excitation for some reason. But anyway, so there's this input coming in, and each neuron has this same type of connectivity in a recurrent competitive field. And this can do a lot. So even though this itself is something that you could take a long time to study and it's fairly high dimensional, this is like often like step one in what can often be a very baroque Grossberg model. Why it can be complicated and take a long time for the grad students is because there's a certain art to picking these functions and getting the parameters right. So the principles work, and Steve, because he doesn't simulate anything, he thinks from the perspective of the solutions. He has an excellent intuition about differential equations, particularly in the steady state. So this F function, which governs both the positive feedback or the reinforcing feedback and the negative feedback, the inhibition, it's the same function, just for simplicity. The choice of what that is will impact what a group of neurons in a recurrent competitive field do to their inputs. And you treat the inputs as if they're one pattern, because they're all interacting with each other. The neurons are interacting with each other. You can think of the entire recurrent competitive field as performing a kind of operation on the entire pattern. And so when it's linear, the overall output, once it equilibrates, is basically the same as the input. It's perfect storage, but there's this issue of amplifying noise, meaning that small fluctuations also show up. And those small fluctuations in input may be irrelevant to the goals. If you have slower than linear, so that as well, it looks like what it is, you get saturation. So everything starts to kind of look the same, flattening. When you have faster than linear transfer functions, you have winner-take-all, very useful type of network, works really well in spiking networks, works too well almost in spiking networks. And then the sigmoid, which is one of the things that Steve gets a lot out of, which has a bit of faster than linear, a bit of sort of almost linear, and a bit of slower than linear. And here you get contrast enhancement. You don't get complete winner take everything, but you also don't get uniformization.
So I have to point out that this all assumes that kind of what a neuron is doing is like a point neuron in that sense. And I'm wondering to what extent this carries over to, things with like dendritic geometry and dendritic nonlinearities and like all this sort of thing.
You can assume f of x is the dendritic feedback. There's no, you can be as agnostic as you want, or posit that f of x is the dendritic component of the neuron. We are fairly agnostic.
But at that point, doesn't it kind of lose its I don't know, like this is a simplification in some sense, right? Like it loses some of its power when the dendrites are so complicated.
Yeah, you have to model each dendrite as if it's a separate thing.
This is the point, like, where can you stop then, right? Like, you always add more. So you can, so tomorrow someone else will say like, this channel was not included in this dendrite, which is actually causing everything. So you can model it if you want, but this is the simplification that we choose because we are not talking about spikes. We are talking about some rate idea. You can, I would say, if you want to go in detail, you can always try to find.
Well, but eventually we are talking about spikes, right? So
no, we're not talking about spikes here. What is spike?
Well, I think Rob's point is that how much of this carries over when you implement, say, a columnar, like laminar.
Oh, but that's kind of what Jesse has tried to do in his work. Jesse has actually.
So so some of my stuff, I think this is a little bit of it's nice to touch on, but it is a little bit divergent from Steve's general stuff.
For sure.
But I think we should be willing to criticize what we think is off, right? Like that's a part of the point of this whole discussion group is to highlight these types of things.
Yeah. I mean, like dendritic dynamics like really weren't like even exposed until the 80s or like 90s. I don't know, like later. It was a while.
I actually have reservations on what the dendritic dynamics actually achieve at the network level. I don't think it does all the job. So I actually believe that local non-linearities can completely be linearized in a network structure. So there is no way one needs to prove one way or the other. So all I'm saying is I'm fairly agnostic. I'm not saying this is against or for this kind of a model. These models.
How I would put it, because I've been interested in these interneurons in layer 2 and 3 everywhere actually, but based on talking to Mac, I'm suddenly fascinated with layer 2, 3 now, but because I feel like that's like the linchpin of a lot of things. But anyway, once you start to have the possibility of, through learning, having non-monotonic transfer functions, all hell breaks loose. But maybe that kind of specificity is of interest, because in fact Karthik himself has been very interested in the question of whether F can be learned, because in most of these models this function is kind of stipulated and then it doesn't change. So what Rob's talking about could be the way to get that. So it's not completely irrelevant. It's just that Steve's nice clean results that are motivated in part by the closed form solutions and certain theorems will no longer be a guide for you once you enter the spiking domain. So it's like, you can take this as like the spherical cow, right? You will probably find regimes in spiking models or even compartmental models with large dendritic trees where you get this stuff to work. But how brittle that is an open question, and I think a good question.
For sure. But I mean, it is sort of doable, and yeah, what complexity and extra computation and dendritic trees bring in is yeah, certainly possible. But to study, I don't think Steve's hung up on any particular equation being the fitting everything at that level, though.
I mean,
to
just to make one last point, to a certain extent, this stuff is like, it's known to be learnable because the HCN channels are, basically shift these activation curves. So
yeah, and it's totally like it's just in my opinion, the reason I haven't even attempted to think about it is because I don't know how to make a learning law for things like that.
So like
at all.
So like in my paper with Steve, I did introduce things that aren't here, right? Like, so distance dependence in terms of connectivity strength, and as well as compartmental model. So it's only 3 compartments, but that constitutes a dendritic tree, and all the same things work with calcium dynamics within the cell. A bunch of extra currents on top of a Hodgkin-Huxley model that's like realistically spiking to some degree, follows cortical pyramidal cells. Certainly some of that breaks down to the precision to which it follows this, and how it breaks down is a complicated matter, but sort of a lot of these principles still actually work even if you add in some level of complexity. A whole dendritic tree is very complicated though, and can do a lot,
do a whole lot.
So more than 3 compartments, but
even now we just don't have the computational power to really look at this stuff without spending weeks on tiny little simulations. So
I would just like to make 2 other points about that. First of all, I mean, this is ignoring Steve's entire framework of the gated dipole models and habituating transmitter functions.
You'll get that.
You cannot use his explanation for stimulus drive associations, et cetera, without considering, or circadian rhythms, and the fact that actually circadian rhythms, you have to have an internal representation, because otherwise a cloudy day would totally screw your behavior. So first of all, I just want to say that there is this whole nother dynamics that's linking into these, cortically driven dynamics that he's trying to model that we're going to have to obviously discuss.
Yeah. There's a lot of detail that we can add.
Yeah. Well, no, but this is not even detail we can add. This is a total other realm of math that Steve needs to explain, how the brain is organized.
Yeah.
And then the second, going back to what you were saying at the beginning in terms of Eric Schwartz's framework, is that one of the most profound things that I think Eric Schwartz ever said to me was, well, when you're thinking about, do you have to make a graph or can you do a field model? And it turns out the number of neurons in the brain are around an order or 2 of magnitude less than you need to be confident doing a field model. And are an order or two of magnitude more than is computationally feasible doing a graph model. He didn't think that that was an accident, but
wow. You have to say, he just said it. He didn't. That's great. What a point that is. The Goldilocks zone for complexity for us.
well, he said to, based on his experience, to be confident that a field model will make sense, you need 10 to the 14th.
That's fascinating. So yeah, a point which again kind of gets buried with Steve is that relative activity plays a huge role in what a pattern is. So the absolute units of the inputs become irrelevant almost immediately because of that lateral inhibition, which serves the purpose of normalization. So the information carrier is the ratio among different cells. For large, like anything that has a kind of rich feature set representation, where the carrier of all that is the ratios. And it's okay in some places. And I think that it becomes tricky when you are interested in analog sensitivity of something. Because you can get symbols out of this easily just by having everything maxed out to, or everything above threshold counts as A or something like that. But where it becomes tricky is when you actually want something that where you have analog sensitivity, like you're linearly controlling something. And maybe that'll come up because when we talk about the Weber law. Okay, so I sent out that collab, the Python thing. I hadn't implemented this in a while, so I thought it would be nice for anyone who's never implemented one of these things to just change parameters and see what happens. So on top, we have the faster than linear. So the cyan plot, it quickly wins over everything else. In these plots, so these are basically versions of what oops, what am I doing? Of this, where this is an initial pattern and then something happens to it. But here I'm just showing a pattern of external input that's just monotonically increasing. So you see what the system does to all the inputs that it receives in a particular range. So this is the solution. So it's the time activity versus time for 3 different transfer functions: faster than linear, slower than linear, where everything becomes quite uniform, and a sigmoid. And here I'm plotting just the time slice, so the 2000th time step, where here you have a winner take all, so it's way up at the max activity, which is 10 now. And in order to compare it, since ratio is what matters up to a point, I just normalized everything just so you could compare qualitatively what each of these transfer functions is doing. So this is the winner take all network. Only one cell is active, everything else is below 0. The slower than linear uniformizes, so the contrast is lost. And here you have in green the sigmoid. So you have, it's not a winner take all, but a subset are kind of like winners, they dominate. But then there's a range where you get a kind of almost linear response, where you have some amount of analog sensitivity in that regime, and everything below is squashed. Quite useful. It seems like very low-level mathematics, but it's very, very useful and very neurally plausible. There are some quirks of getting it to work with spikes because of divisive normalization, and I'm sure we will talk about this in future. So in this chapter 1, which is sort of like an ad, say that there's like, oh, look at all the things I've done. He throws in this thing, which is kind of fun actually, this democracy and totalitarianism thing, where in this particular analogy, the units are people, and the transfer function determines how they communicate with each other. So you just change that and nothing else. And if you treat their activity as their wealth or status or something, like that, then you have this is Jesse's version of that same type of diagram. You can interpret some of these. Winner take all is sort of monopoly capitalism or totalitarianism. Slower than linear, where everyone gets the same outcome, is Steve's cartoon of socialism. And the sigmoid didn't really say what it is, but I think we will say something about it later. But the reason is that, well, he talks about like people not getting rewards for their effort, which is, you know, kind of a conservative point, but it's like, yeah, so, if anyone can get high activity by very little effort, a slower than linear system will amplify everything. So you want.
Is this a point, Jesse, is this a point in your paper, Steve?
No, this is in the book.
Okay.
Yeah,
The diagram is from Jesse's paper.
just the diagram on the left.
I was gonna say
I didn't put socialism in my paper.
If you were talking to Steve about socialism and didn't consult us,
No.
I would have been offended.
Yes, good point.
By the way, Johan, there is a history to why he actually talks about it. This is not just a work of him like trying to write.
Yeah, you told me. Yeah. What was it?
In the late 70s, he actually did publish a few papers which were more economy related, using these kinds of stuff, where he wants to talk about consensus and I think the paper was called Consensus, Competition, and Decision Making. He thought he was competing with the great Arnaud Debreu, who was like a big economist after Kenneth Arrow. And he said, like, it's kind of true. It is a better model than the Debreu model if you go and look at the Debreu model. Once you know this model and look at Debreu's work. So he was like saying, like, oh, look at Debreu's work on like how, you know, value is produced and like, you know, societies change and all that. Here I have a better model where I can come to better consensus. In a purely competitive society, I can reach various consensus. So this was kind of his answer to Debreu. I don't think it gained the traction that Debreu's model actually gained, but whatever.
And maybe now's the time. I like this stuff. I make fun of it, but I like it because, I don't know, a few years ago, you guys remember, I used to be very against any kind of anthropomorphization of things in the brain. But now I've kind of softened my, because it's sort of like, well, we don't really understand social dynamics and we don't understand the brain either. So, okay, if you want to talk about one in terms of the other, it's not so bad.
I think on this one, the nice thing is that what Steve did was, I mean, it was really a general analysis of competitive cooperative networks, right? And so even the stuff you'd see in like Piketty, you know, like the idea that returns to capital outpace, you know, the gains made by growth of the economy or whatever, like all of that stuff is sort of encapsulated in this very simple idea of faster than linear, slower than linear, and sigmoidal transfer functions, right?
But
so,
we've talked about this before. Maybe we should bring it up again later. Is there's no equivalent of debt or credit, for that matter, in such networks. And I think that will probably make a big difference.
Well, no, I mean, I think in any of these recurrent competitive fields, the starting state is the amount, you can think of it as the amount of money you have, the amount of capital you have, or whatever. With a faster than linear transfer function, you essentially have the ability, the analog would be like you have the ability to basically squash everybody else. Your money makes money faster than everyone else's money. It means, you know, your positive feedback loop is going to outpace everybody else's. You kill everybody else off, given positive feedback loops. And
I would just like to point out, going back to my previous discussion of the gated dipole and habituating synapses, that you do have a capital market if you include those in the network.
Including debt?
If you have habituating synapses, you have a capital market.
Okay. Well, I will bookmark that for later because it's almost 11. So
that would be an interesting one to go over.
We should definitely talk about that. Okay, so I just want one little glimpse at one step beyond the recurrent competitive field is the big thing, adaptive resonance theory. What is it? And Steve's diagrams are not super helpful, but basically,
Johan, before you do that, you should preface that one RCF is what the current competitive field is, what is the equivalent of a STM for Steve. So
good. Yes, thank you. So you compose a art network out of bits that are themselves recurrent competitive fields. So you stack one on top of the other. One is receiving the input from the other and sending feedback back down. So the categories get to compete with each other, and if it's very simple, the features don't necessarily compete with each other, but in higher order parts of the network, even the features may compete with each other. The features could be any sort of feature, but I have an example coming just right now. So the idea is that some sort of top level, higher level category is both inhibiting and exciting the lower level, and that's why it's different from active inference, which I'll just make a point about that. But do you guys remember Yanni and Laurel? So there was this meme, I can send it out later, but I'll quickly go through this. But there was this thing where there was a weird sound, and some people heard it as Yanni and some people heard it as Laurel. I remember circulating this. Someone sent it, and I thought it was a prank because I could not for the life of me hear Laurel or imagine that anyone could hear Laurel. And Karthik was the opposite. He could only hear Laurel. And I tried at various volumes, and then I moved from my phone to my computer, and then I could hear Laurel, and then I could no longer hear Yanni for several hours. And it was very weird. And I highly recommend it if you haven't tried it. I can send out the. So there were people quite baffled and mystified by it, and there were very bad takes about it, where people were like, we just need to find out what it actually is, which I thought was like completely missing the point of why it was interesting. And the same is true of that dress, where people are like, oh, I'm so fed up of that dress. It's like, but of all the memes you could imagine, this is great because it's, as close as you get to phenomenology becoming a meme, right? Like subjective experience that people can disagree about in an interesting way. So anyway, you can imagine this as like a little toy art network, where in this case, we're dealing with sounds. So the frequency map has a concrete meaning. I have groups of neurons representing, it's a tonotopic map. So I have a range of frequencies, and they have bottom-up signals to a higher level representation, which is a chunk of some sort of meaningful thing that becomes active when I do hear Laurel, definitely. And another one gets active when I hear Yanni, and they inhibit each other because they're usually mutually exclusive, or you can calibrate it so that they're mutually exclusive. And through, like, if it's something that you experience, you get learning on both the weights going up and the weights coming back down. And what that means is that the weights that this Laurel node receives are its representation of what it's looking for its maximum activity, and the weights going back down are basically the ability of Laurel to kind of reconstruct its favorite input. Think of it that way. So this is a basic way to start thinking about this. And in the case of some people were looking at this phenomenon, and they removed different parts of the spectrum. They like use the frequency analyzer to like increase the bass and reduce the bass and things like that. So when you lopped off a lot of the high frequency, most people, but not all people, were able to hear Laurel, even the ones who were formerly hearing Yanni. So that particular set of features is missing, and that node gets less active. So this one becomes less inhibited and becomes active. And the opposite was generally the case if you deleted sound part of the spectrum from the other end. But there were people who continued to hear the other percept, even when the frequency information that was needed was absent. And here's where this kind of way of thinking really kind of comes into its own, because if you have some sort of drive or bias or memory or some kind of quirk that has modified the weights, you could have Laurel continuing to be active, even though big chunks of its actual features are missing. So how will that work? This particular weight is so active that it's kind of hallucinating the low frequencies. So Steve uses the term filling in. So in a lot of different kinds of models, the top-down influence fills in what's missing. And this is a very, very useful feature of models to up to a point. It's like a sort of guarded and carefully calibrated hallucination, which is almost like smoothing over things in order to make simpler percept/representations. And here's where we can compare this to ideas.
Johan, you can also compare this to We'll talk about it in more detail later, like maybe like 6 months from now, when Saurabh will talk about his phonemic restoration stuff. That bias memory part of it is also related to the fact that depending on whether it was masked or whether there was a noise, that biasing will change whether you will be able to, reconstruct that phoneme that people usually typically lose or are able to gain it back. So depending on the mask, the bias can go either way. So that
I think masking is a complicated topic, but I will definitely invite Saurabh to give us the deal on that at the time when it's right. I myself have not fully understood masking fields, so I keep thinking about it. But okay, so when you see top-down and bottom-up interactions, the first thing to compare it to is predictive coding. It's worth saying that there's three concepts that are in this word cloud altogether: Bayesian brain, predictive coding, and free energy principle. But they're actually kind of all different. And here I'm just talking about the predictive coding / active inference, the neo-Helmholtzian worldview, which is very, very popular now. I wasn't sure, but then I checked with this review paper by Friston that, so he himself points out that there are some formal similarities with predictive coding, but the most important difference is that in this scheme, explaining away just means countering excitatory bottom-up inputs to a prediction error signal with inhibitory synaptic inputs that are driven by top-down predictions. This is a huge difference, because the only thing that the top-down input influence is doing is removing what was predicted. Whereas with the positive feedback that comes from in art, you're able to do this whole other thing, which is filling in feedback, occasionally producing hallucinations and things like that. So this is a huge difference to keep in mind. So here's another review, the Sprackling review. And you see it again here. The round synapses are the ones going top down. They're all inhibitory. So they're computing differences between the predicted and actual signals. And I think there's a good reason for it. There's no positive feedback and no resonance. So Steve calls that agreement between top-down and bottom-up resonance. Coming from a physics background, I have some quibbles about calling this resonance. I don't think it's resonance, but but why don't people use positive feedback? I actually asked Karthik this, and this is maybe Nico, you'll have some input on this, because I rarely see it in models, positive feedback, reinforcing feedback outside of engineering. And I think the answer is that it's very hard to work with. That once you go away from directed acyclic graphs, and I think then it's very difficult to have stable structures on which to do subsequent probabilistic learning. This is just a guess right now. It's something to think about, but I don't know why it's not as and I also think that you can do neat closed form.
I think there is also a historical. I think there is also a partial historical neglect. The reason as to why most people don't use positive feedback, which is that most people, whenever they think about feedback, they are always coming from a control theory, PID background, where an overwhelming amount of feedback, emphasis on feedback is always on negative feedback and not much on positive feedback at all, unless you're like talking about specific electronic circuits where people use like Birkhoff criteria or all that.
You can't have an op-amp without positive feedback, right?
Yeah, but there are very few people who are actually taking that to the next step, right? Like the op-amp electrical engineer knows it very well. But if you want to build like robotic PID controllers on top of that, most people don't usually include a positive feedback. They always tend to want to correct for some error or all that stuff. So it can have local positive feedback, but they don't want that to be propagated overall because it's very hard for them to control. So I think it is sort of a bias that's kind of come from a certain reading of control theory and PID controllers. But that's one view. But
there may be another perspective on this also from the sort of more machine learning-y neural networky side. Backprop with feedback. If you have multiple layers and there's feedback between layers, the backprop equations become a lot more messy, and so it's something that's just effectively just been avoided because it's not clear when you halt the number of steps you would take, or feedback. If it's discrete, you don't know how many discrete steps to take. If it's continuous, it's clearer, but when you stop the feedback, it's just generally something that's been avoided in most cases. Recurrent neural networks have always been considered to be more finicky until much more recently as well. So feedback has always been something that on the artificial neural network side was just very much sort of avoided.
So art has a lot of complexity too. That's like makes it really difficult to deal with. Even though it's sort of the idea was it would, in theory, be dynamic, like the dynamics that we were just talking about earlier. That becomes difficult because there really are different kind of phases of operation in it. So while it could be dynamic, you need somehow to like manage that. But you also need three. So here in the Sprackling and the Friston stuff, you notice that there's an alternation between two layers. So there's the computation and then there's the error signal. In Steve's stuff, there's actually 3 layers. So it's F0, F1, F2. And you can't really do it with 2. Like you can't really do, I mean, the first layer you could say is not really doing anything. It's just sitting around like holding on to the input and passing it along. But it has to be maintained. Like it has to be there. Without it there, and yeah, so it could be kind of the previous layer, but I think that doesn't quite work either. So I think you kind of do need 3 layers. Maybe there's a way to do it with 2 layers, but which is sort of an important difference too. And I think that relates to the feedback aspect.
Yeah, I agree. So this is just a way to say that all of us who have worked with positive feedback, we like it conceptually. We don't particularly like it computationally because it's a big mess. It's a real nightmare to work with. Like when I make spiking models, they don't have easy divisive normalization. So when I put positive feedback in, which I know is reasonable for certain applications, particularly working memory, you kind of swamp the thing in inhibition, or you have the problem of runaway excitation to extremely unrealistic firing rates. So it's and this weird game you have to play with EI balance.
I just would like to point out that Ken Miller's models do have recurrent excitation.
Excellent. Okay. Well, yeah.
His whole shtick is a way of doing inhibitorially stabilized feedback. So.
Okay. Good. I need to look at that kind of thing. So just to end, have any of you guys read the conclusion of Steve's opus from '64? It's quite stunning. There's this whole idealistic thing about how a rational understanding of the human needs, whose fulfillment is the proper aim of this unification, truly harmonious social order, and there's a lot of idealism here. And he also points out that when you're studying humanity, it's not just abstract science like studying chemistry or physics. When men study men, the reasons are familiar and the applications are direct, slightly ominous almost. So I like this. It's almost like he wants a Hippocratic oath for people who study behavior, because he's like a grave personal responsibility in wisely applying this new knowledge. There's a lot here. I'm quite surprised and impressed with this conclusion, which reminded me of something from several decades later. Planets don't care what scientists think about their behavior. They move around the sun with complete indifference to how physicists and astronomers theorize about them. Genes are indifferent to our theories about them also, but this is not true of people. Theories about human nature can actually produce changes in how people behave. And Steve was right on that same page. This worries me a lot, so I was fascinated to see it. Anyway. So yeah, we'll dive in hopefully to something more specific next. We'll go to chapter 2, it's shorter, and we'll start to look more deeply into this his ideas about vision. And I just put this here because even though also they misspelled Luis Pessoa's name. Pessoa is one of his own students. But yeah, even though there's a sense in which he's slightly an obscure figure in neuroscience, people don't know what exactly he's done and what his theories mean. But these big names are at least familiar with him. I doubt any of them actually read the whole book, but but he's got quite a bit of glowing praise. So yeah, that's all I had for now. And we can, any other comments? We can stop recording.
You know, I dropped a few references into the chat that people might find interesting. One was the Pessoa review of filling out what we know about filling in, which continues to remain one of my very favorite BBS target articles. And the other one is a historical book about trying to measure human intelligence in France and the US, which gets into what we were just discussing at the end of this.
Oh, Pessoa wrote this with Evan Thompson and Alvin Noy. Wow. So that inactivist circle overlaps with the Grossbergian circle. I had no idea. Wow. That's super cool. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and we can be off the record.